When he got home early from a business meeting, millionaire Richard Thompson never thought he would find his wife, Victoria, making his 12-year-old daughter, Amelia, clean the opulent bathroom floor with her bare hands while yelling, "People like you need to learn early on where his place is in this house." The girl was kneeling on the cold marble, silently crying as she scrubbed a stain that was obviously not there. Her tiny hands trembled out of embarrassment rather than the cold. Richard had never seen such a bitter delight in 15 years of marriage as Victoria, with his flawless blonde hair and pricey jewelry, watched the sight. "And stop whining," said Victoria. Richard stood motionless in the bathroom doorway, taking in the devilish sight that was playing out in front of her. "Her mother isn't here to defend you. You're going to learn to be useful, or you're leaving this house with her." After 6 years of service, Grace, their devoted housekeeper, had gone out to acquire cleaning materials. Victoria had been waiting for this very moment to reveal her true nature to a helpless kid. Richard had amassed a $300 million real estate empire by the time he was 45. He had always taken pride in treating every employee with dignity and respect. But then there was her. A woman who talked about social equality and smiled sweetly at charity functions while psychologically abusing a 12-year-old girl named Victoria. Richard's wife turned abruptly as he spoke in a low, controlled voice that was packed with intensity. "I didn't hear you enter, Richard." Her face suddenly broke into a phony smile. "I was merely imparting some duty to Grace's daughter. If we don't teach kids from a young age, you know how it is." Amelia used the back of her hand to wipe away her tears as she hurried to stand up. Richard, however, could see the terror in her eyes. It wasn't simply terror of Victoria. It was the kind of anxiety that kids have when they are humiliated by people who are meant to be protecting them all the time. "What sort of obligations?" Richard approached the two of them gently and inquired. Victoria made a worried gesture. "Oh, you know. Fundamental organizing, cleaning, and future useful items." Richard ignored Victoria entirely and stooped to Amelia's level. "How are you, my love?" Clearly assessing if it was safe to give an honest response, the girl cast a short glance at Victoria. She muttered, "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson." However, Richard's success as a businessman wasn't a coincidence. People knew when someone was lying out of fear because he could read their minds. And when he saw the child trembling in front of her, something inside of him shifted. Something that even his business rivals would instantly recognize. The terrifying quiet before a destructive storm. He had been noticing little odd indicators for years. Amelia would occasionally be brought to work by Grace, and when Victoria was present, the girl would clearly become agitated. Every time he walked into a room, the conversation would halt. When she believed he wasn't listening, she spoke about educating these folks. Everything made obvious now. Victoria was unaware, however, that she had just roused something inside Richard that she would never be able to control or influence. Richard murmured softly, "Go grab a food in the kitchen, Amelia. Her mum will return shortly." When the girl ran off, Richard turned to Victoria with an expression that she had never seen before. It was the same expression that he used when he was about to completely destroy a competitor in business. "We need to talk," he said simply. But Victoria hadn't yet realized that she had just crossed a line of no return. She didn't know that Richard had grown up in a poor family and that her black grandmother had been humiliated by wealthy employers in the same way. And most importantly, she had no idea that this moment of gratuitous cruelty was about to cost her much more than her conscience could imagine. If you're feeling the same outrage as Richard at this point, subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of cruelty would turn into a lesson in justice that none of those involved would ever forget. That evening, during the dinner served by Grace, Richard observed every interaction with the microscopic attention that his business rivals knew so well. Victoria was particularly excited, talking about the charity event she would be organizing the following month to help needy children, while Amelia remained in the kitchen, clearly avoiding any eye contact with her boss. "Honey, you haven't touched the salmon," Victoria commented, smiling sweetly. Grace outdid herself today. "I was thinking about our conversation earlier," Richard replied, cutting a piece of food without actually eating it. "About raising children. Victoria laughed, a sound that once had been musical to his ears, but now seemed strangely false. "Oh, you know how I am. Sometimes I'm too strict, but it's for her own good. These people need to understand boundaries from an early age." "These people," Richard repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "You know what I mean," Victoria said, pouring herself more wine. "If we don't establish a hierarchy, she starts to forget her place. Amelia was playing in the main room yesterday, getting the suede sofa dirty. I had to be firm." Richard felt something cold run down her spine. "Firm how?" "Nothing too much. I just explained that certain areas of the house are for the family, not for, well, you understand." What Richard understood was that his wife of 15 years had revealed herself to be someone completely different from the woman he had fallen in love with. Or perhaps, and this possibility was even more disturbing, she had always been this way and he had simply never paid attention to the signs. That night, unable to sleep, Richard went down to his office and turned on his computer. For 2 hours, he revisited memories he had buried decades ago. Her grandmother, Josephine, a dignified black woman who had worked as a maid for wealthy families her entire life. He remembered weekends at her house, listening to stories about cruel mistresses who made him redo perfect work out of pure sadism. "Richard, my boy," she would say, "never forget where you came from. Money can change your situation, but it can't change your heart. And if one day you have power, remember how it feels to be trampled on." Josephine had died when he was 16, but her words had shaped every ethical decision in his career. Now at 45, a respected multimillionaire, he discovered that he was married to exactly the kind of person who had tortured her grandmother. The next morning, Richard decided to work from home. He settled into his office with a door ajar, pretending to be absorbed in spreadsheets while discreetly observing the dynamics of the house. What he discovered over the next few hours was even worse than he had imagined. Victoria had developed an elaborate system of psychological cruelty. Whenever Grace went out shopping or was busy elsewhere in the house, she would find Amelia and invent humiliating tasks for her. She made the girl reorganize the library alphabetically, then by color, then by size. She made her clean windows that were already spotless. She made her sweep the same hallway multiple times. "You're too slow," Richard heard Victoria say sharply when Amelia took too long to fold linen napkins. "At her age, I already knew how to work properly. However, you're not the same, are you?" Richard clenched his fists beneath the table at the casual harshness in her speech. Victoria was not merely mistreating a youngster. She was methodically attempting to crush Amelia's soul in order to force her to acknowledge that he was not as good a person as she was. At lunch, Victoria said nonchalantly, "You know, dear, I think we need to talk about Grace and her daughter's boundaries in this house. They're getting too comfortable." "Comfortable how?" Richard inquired, anticipating more poison presented as domestic worry. "Lately, Amelia has shown a lot of courage. I saw her perusing books in the library the other day." "Books are expensive, Richard." She also inquired yesterday as to whether his shoes were Italian. Curiosity like that is unhealthy. Richard's water nearly choked him. "You're annoyed that a 12-year-old asked inquisitive inquiries." Victoria argued that the questions weren't innocent. Envy is the cause. She is beginning to wonder why she doesn't have the same lovely things that we do. Such a way of thinking creates more serious issues. Richard finally realized who he was married to at that precise time. Victoria viewed Amelia as a possible danger to the social order that she deemed normal and desirable, rather than as an inquisitive and bright youngster. It was morally required of Victoria to keep a black girl in his place. Richard and Grace had a thoughtful talk that afternoon while Victoria was in the spa. It was devastating what he found. Victoria had been routinely making fun of Amelia for months, but only when Grace wasn't present. Fearing that they would lose their employment, the girl had pleaded with her mother to keep quiet. "Mr. Thompson," Grace replied, her eyes welling with tears. Richard stared at this woman who had maintained his house immaculate for 6 years, who was raising an educated and brilliant daughter by herself, and who was being tormented by an unachievable circumstance. "I need this job." I have nowhere else to go with Amelia, but I don't know what to do anymore. He was more than a husband, addressing his wife at that moment. Richard made his own plans that night, while Victoria cheerfully explained her plans for the charity event. He was Josephine's grandson, and the time had finally come to honor the promise he had made at her grave. "Grace," he said calmly, "you aren't going anywhere," but Victoria is unaware that she has just awakened something she should never have touched. Victoria believed she knew her husband, a prosperous businessman who was largely inactive at home. She was unaware that Richard Thompson had amassed his empire by methodically eliminating those who misjudged her ability to exact calculated retribution, and that ability would be aimed at someone in his own home for the first time in their 15 years of marriage. In addition to being an act of needless cruelty, Victoria was soon to realize that humiliating the maid's 12-year-old daughter was the largest strategic error of her life. The next Monday, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He called off all of his meetings. He worked from home all day, ostensibly in his office. But in practice, he was using a covert camera system he had set up over the weekend to record his wife's every move. Even more methodical and brutal than he had anticipated was what he found over the first few hours. Victoria had created a detailed timetable for torturing people's minds. Every day at 9:15 a.m., Grace would call Amelia for assistance with impossible things when she went shopping, sort the china cabinet again by size, color, and polish, mirrors that were spotless before they were thoroughly cleaned. On a breezy morning, sweeping leaves from the garden, Victoria would add, "You're taking too long," in that lovely voice Richard was so familiar with, but which suddenly seemed like honey disguised as poison. I already knew how to work correctly at her age. However, you're not the same, are you? You must understand her place from a young age. Richard took notes on everything. Every insensitive utterance, needless humiliation, an instance in which his wife purposefully crushed the soul of a 12-year-old who had done nothing more than be born into the wrong household. However, Richard found something on Tuesday that fundamentally altered his approach. He discovered a box of letters that Victoria believed she had concealed while sorting through old wedding documents. When Grace began taking Amelia to work during the school breaks 2 years ago, she was communicating with her friends from a social club. Read one of the letters in Victoria's fine handwriting. "Patricia, the annoyance of having this young black youngster running around the house is unimaginable. He seems to be unsure of his position. I saw her looking through periodicals in the main living room yesterday. Patricia, expensive magazines. Some things aren't for someone like her, and I had to be firm about it. I am considering recommending that she cease bringing the girl." Reading those words made Richard sick. As Victoria had attempted to explain, she wasn't simply mistreating Amelia out of impulsiveness or stress. It was a planned effort to correct the girl before his innate brilliance threatened the social order that Victoria held in high regard. Richard called James Mitchell, the most reputable private investigator in town, and one of the few black men who had succeeded in breaking past the restrictions of the local professional elite. That afternoon, while Victoria was in the spa receiving treatments with the money he earned, "Richard Thompson," was James' response. "I wasn't expecting your call. I hear you're in need of some special services. How did you know? Let's just say that certain news travels fast in certain circles. Grace Williams works for him, doesn't she? His daughter, Amelia, goes to the same school as my niece, a bright girl, but lately she's been strangely quiet." Richard realized that James already knew much more than he was saying. "I need your help documenting some situations that are happening in my home." Situations involving his wife and Grace's daughter. Richard's silence was answer enough. "I understand perfectly," James continued. "Coincidentally, I've been noticing some troubling patterns of behavior in certain families of the local elite. Her, for example, has been quite active in the preservation of traditional values group on Facebook. Interesting posts about maintaining natural hierarchies and properly educating certain people." Richard had never heard of this group. What kind of posts? Screenshots of conversations where she and other society women discuss methods for disciplining employees who don't know their place. Her wife is particularly eloquent about training children from an early age to accept their social position. Richard's blood ran cold. Victoria wasn't just abusing Amelia. She was sharing methods of cruelty with other elite women, as if it were a social hobby. James, I need everything you can find on these activities, and I need evidence that will be unquestionable in any court of law. I've been working on it for 3 weeks, Richard. Ever since, my niece told me that Amelia arrived at school in tears after being forced to apologize to her wife for looking at things she wasn't supposed to. That evening, as Victoria excitedly described his plans for a charity gala to help less fortunate children, Richard watched every gesture, every inflection of his voice, every fake smile that he could now see with absolute clarity. She poured herself a French wine that was more expensive than Grace's monthly pay, and added, "You know, dear, I think I finally managed to teach Grace's daughter some important lessons lately. She has shown a lot more respect." "What sort of instruction?" Richard asked casually. "Oh, nothing much. Just explaining about appropriate boundaries, about respecting property that isn't his. Children need to understand hierarchies from an early age. Don't you think?" Richard nodded, pretending to agree while mentally adding another recorded confession to the growing mountain of evidence against her. The next morning, James called with a discovery that would change everything. "Richard, you need to see what I found in the records of domestic workers who worked for her before Grace. In the last 10 years, at least 6 families have resigned without explanation. I managed to contact 3 of them, and they all had daughters between the ages of 8 and 15. They all reported that her daughters began to have psychological problems after a few months of working in her home. One of the mothers said her daughter developed panic attacks whenever she saw blonde women." Richard realized he had uncovered not just an isolated case of cruelty, but a decades-long pattern of systematic abuse that her wife had perfected into a sadistic art form. "James," he said, her voice taking on the icy tone he used to destroy competitors in business, "I want you to document everything, every post, every message, every testimony. And I want you to prepare a complete dossier that leaves no room for alternative interpretations. It's already being prepared. But Richard, I need to warn you. When this comes to light, it won't just destroy her wife. It will shake the entire social structure of this city. There are a lot of powerful people involved in her group." Richard smiled, but it wasn't a smile Victoria would recognize. It was the smile that appeared when he was about to completely rewrite the rules of the game. "James, let me tell you something about his grandmother, Josephine. She always said that when you have real power, you don't use it to protect yourself. You use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves." As he hung up the phone, Richard realized that Victoria had just awakened not only a betrayed husband, but the grandson of a woman who had suffered decades of silent humiliation, and unlike Josephine, he had enough resources, influence, and connections to ensure that justice was not only served, but that it became a permanent example. What Victoria didn't know was that his next training session with Amelia would be documented not only for personal use, but for a much wider audience than she could ever imagine. On Thursday, the day of Victoria's charity event to help needy children, Richard set in motion a plan that would turn the most anticipated gala night of the year into a public spectacle that none of those present would ever forget. The grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel was impeccable, with 300 members of high society in attendance, including politicians, businesspeople, journalists, and influential figures in national philanthropy. Victoria circulated radiantly in his $15,000 dress, receiving compliments for his generosity and concern for the welfare of less fortunate children. "Tonight is about giving opportunities to young people who were born into less privileged circumstances," Victoria said from the stage, her melodious voice echoing through the hall. "I believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of his background." The applause was warm. Flashes went off as she smiled for the cameras, completely oblivious to the fact that Richard was at the head table, watching every move of hers with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. James Mitchell, elegantly dressed and wearing a press badge, circulated discreetly among the guests. distributing tablets with a presentation that would forever change everyone's perception of the hostess of the evening. At 9:30, just as Victoria took the stage for her keynote speech, Richard calmly rose from her table. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone, interrupting his wife. "Before my dear wife continues talking about dignity and respect for children, I would like to share with everyone some interesting discoveries I have made recently." The silence in the hall was instantaneous. Victoria looked at Richard with an expression of growing confusion, still not fully understanding what was happening. "James," Richard called, and the investigator approached the stage carrying a laptop. "Could you show us the videos you documented this week?" The first recording appeared on the giant screen behind Victoria. It was her forcing Amelia to reorganize the china cabinet for the 5th time in a row. Shouting, "People like you need to learn from an early age what is his place in this house." As the crowd gasped in surprise, Victoria became paler as she realized the full scope of Richard's findings. Richard went on, "This is her voice resonating through the flawless acoustics of the hall, methodically degrading a 12-year-old child whose only transgression was to be born into the wrong family." In the second video, Victoria was shown purposefully toppling a vase of flowers and making Amelia use her bare hands to wipe up the broken pieces. In the third clip, she was heard smiling while talking to a friend on the phone about how she had caused the girl to cry. Victoria whispered into the microphone, "Richard, stop this," but the entire crowd could hear her voice. "Everything is being taken out of context by you." Background. Opening a folder of papers, James Mitchell took the stage. Perhaps we might put it in context by using these discussions about how to discipline employees who don't know their place in the preservation of traditional values Facebook group. The screen displayed screenshots of Victoria's posts, messages in which she talked about humiliating other women in society and putting the maid's little daughter in her place. The crowd started to move. Some visitors, obviously not wanting to be linked to the crisis that was playing out in real time, stood up and moved towards the exit. Additionally, we have the testimonials of 6 former families who were employed by the Thompsons. James added, "Similar patterns of psychological assault, specifically targeted at the employees' daughters, are reported by everyone." Richard gently obstructed Victoria's attempt to exit the stage. He answered, "We're not done yet, dear," with a chilly tone in his voice. She had never heard it before. The visitors must be clear about who they are supporting this evening. The most terrible recording was the 4th one. Victoria talking to her best friend Patricia on the phone. "I broke the spirit of that young black girl, and you should see it. She no longer even meets my gaze. At last, he has grasped his role." The hall was suddenly completely silent. The only sound to break the silence was the dragging of chairs as more people stood up to depart. Flashing cameras were used feverishly to record one of the decade's largest social scandals, rather than to film charitable gestures. Richard Victoria made another attempt, tears starting to fall down his meticulously manicured face. "Could we discuss this at home?" "At home?" Richard's laugh was not a joyful one. "You've lost your home, Victoria. This morning, the divorce papers were filed. According to the prenuptial agreement you signed, which you reportedly never completely redo, will receive 50% of the assets." James went back to the microphone. "Additionally, I want to let you know that the State Attorney General's office has decided to launch a formal inquiry into the case of moral harassment and maltreatment of a minor after considering all of the evidence that was submitted. This afternoon, the documents were handed. The truth of her predicament hit Victoria like an avalanche, causing her to actually fall, her legs giving way. The scandal was more than just a social one. Her life as she knew it was coming to an end." Finally, with his voice now a little softer, Richard continued, "I would like to introduce everyone to Amelia Williams." The 12-year-old girl entered the platform, wearing a beautiful dress and brand new shoes instead of her old, baggy clothes. With the dignity of someone who could finally hold her head high, Grace strolled behind him. With a full scholarship from the Thompson Foundation, Amelia will begin attending St. Margaret's Preparatory School on Monday. The timid applause turned into a standing ovation for Richard's bravery in exposing the hypocrisy and for Grace and Amelia's dignity after months of humiliation. Richard said, "Grace has been promoted to domestic operations manager of our company with a salary of $40,000 a year and all the benefits." Looking straight at the live broadcasting cameras, Richard came to the conclusion that true philanthropy isn't paying to be in pictures, it is making sure that a bright youngster, regardless of her skin color or her family's financial situation, has the same possibilities as everyone else. The camera flashes followed Victoria as she stumbled towards the back exit after finally managing to get to her feet. Her charitable activities, social standing, and connections with the local elite were all irreparably harmed. As a heartbreaking illustration of bigotry masquerading as generosity, the tale was on the top page of every local newspaper the following day and went viral on social media. All philanthropic boards formally kicked Victoria off. Even the upscale beauty salon he regularly visited cancelled his upcoming appointments, and her friends stopped returning his calls. Richard, meantime, watched Amelia play in the house's garden, at last able to be a kid without worrying about looking foolish. The entire issue was still clouded by one question, though. Was Victoria truly aware of the moral ramifications of her actions? Or did she just worry about the social repercussions of being discovered? Even Richard, with his meticulous planning, could not have foreseen how the answer would arrive. The change was finished 3 months later. Amelia had the self-assurance of a kid who had finally realized her own value as she traversed the halls of St. Margaret's Preparatory School. She excelled academically and rose to the position of student council leader, spearheading anti-bullying initiatives that motivated schools around the state. Grace, who is currently the operations manager at Thompson Enterprises, managed a staff of 15 workers and made more money in a month than she did as a cleaning lady in a year. Richard had found that he was just as efficient in his administration as she was in her cleaning. In contrast, Victoria was suffering from severe social isolation. His old social connections had abandoned him entirely. Following a government inquiry, the Preservation of Traditional Values group was shut down, and 3 of its members were charged with racial discrimination. The palace, where she had formerly reigned like a cruel queen, stood in stark contrast to the tiny flat she had managed to rent with her divorce settlement. Amelia said to Grace, "Mom, can I invite my friend Emma over for dinner on Saturday?" While they were organizing paperwork in the office. "Of course, dear. Our home has always had an open door for your friends." Richard watched the scene from his desk, remembering the words of his grandmother, Josephine. True power is not humiliating those below you. It is elevating those who deserve to be at the top. The sweetest justice was not seeing Victoria lose everything she valued, but witnessing Amelia discover everything she always deserved to have. A child who once cleaned floors on her knees because of the cruelty of others, now debated public policy at student conferences, proving the talent knows no color, social class, or origin. Victoria had tried to destroy the spirit of a 12-year-old girl out of pure prejudice. Instead, she ended up creating one of the most promising young leaders of the new generation. Amelia not only survived cruelty, but she thrived despite it, turning her pain into purpose and her humiliation into strength. True charity, Richard learned, is not donating money to appear in photos. It is recognizing human potential where others see only prejudice, and ensuring that no child has his future limited by the ignorance of adults who confuse privilege with superiority. If this story of transformation has touched his heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the best revenge against her is to build a world where she finds no place to flourish.